Today marks 100 years since the end of World War I. What are some stories and facts that we should hear or know about this war to end all wars? There are still mines, shells, and bombs being rolled up in farmers' fields all over Europe to this day. They call it the Iron Harvest, and every spring you can see some of these relics set out for collection beside the front gates of many farms. Unfortunately, you may also hear about a farmer who got blown off his tractor by one that was still live. In addition, entire swaths of France are still cordoned off as a zone rouge, where so much ordnance still remains that even setting foot within the fences is hazardous. There were entire villages destroyed or abandoned within these areas, and there are places where nothing even grows due to high concentrations of arsenic and other toxic materials. Even some safe areas across France and Belgium still bear pock marks left by shelling that ended 100 years ago, long dips that used to be trenches, and an unknowable amount of remains of soldiers who died and have been forgotten. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British Army suffered 57,470 casualties. The Italians thought they developed completely bulletproof armor for their soldiers. It was handed out for testing to a division on the Austrian front. The officer in charge thought, since the armor was obviously bulletproof, that they could just walk on plain field in the middle of the day towards the enemy trenches. Needless to say, it didn't end well. At least in the British Army and, I suspect, in others. Men were grouped into PALS battalions. Men recruited from the same location at the same time were sent in as a group, so they already knew the rest of their battalion. This meant that, when battalions were wiped out, whole villages lost all their men. In Georgia, the country, not the US state, a group of men wearing armor from the Crusades, armed with broadswords and shields, marched up to the capital and said, "We hear there's a war." Aviation was in its infancy, and at first planes were used for reconnaissance. Because they hadn't yet figured out how to mount guns to them, pilots on opposing sides would wave to each other, feeling a certain congeniality. Eventually things turned more bitter, and pilots started carrying pistols or rifles to snipe at opposing pilots. I've even read of a brick being thrown. Later, machine guns were mounted in front of the pilot, but they hadn't figured out how not to shoot off the plane's own propeller. An early solution was to reinforce the propeller with metal plates designed to ricochet bullets away, and just shoot anyway. At a demonstration of this technology, ricochets killed a bystander. Later still, they figured out how to synchronize the firing of the guns with the turning of the propeller, so as to fire between the blades. An early Newport warplane was infamous for its wings falling off in steep dives. To test just how steeply the plane was capable of diving, one ace took it up and dove at increasingly steep angle until the wings began to disintegrate. This knowledge was helpful to other pilots. The USA's most capable ace, Eddie Rickenbacker, was a former race car driver who theorized that given their familiarity with engines and fast speeds, race car drivers would make excellent fighter pilots. He also Americanized his name from Rickenbacker, so it would sound less German. He had 26 confirmed kills, the most of any American pilot. The Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, had 80 confirmed kills, the most of any pilot in the war. His younger brother Lothar amassed 40. My grandfather was standing in line when entering the army for World War I. At some point he was asked if he had any special skills, and he answered that he was a professional musician. And that's how my grandfather spent World War I in an army band, despite not knowing how to read music or play an instrument. Don't forget that often all eligible men in a small town would sign up, be put in the same troop, which would then experience a massacre or failure. The town would lose all of its young men. The first soldiers to withstand a gas attack had no idea what it was and just sort of died horribly from the chlorine. I read this in a Ripley's book. Obviously a lot of young boys had lied about their age to fight in the war, but the youngest was said to be a boy named Momcilo Gavric from Serbia, who was 9 years old. After helmets became standard gear for British soldiers, Whitehall was initially confused by the sudden sharp increase in head injuries. It was later realized the increase was because before the helmets everyone was simply being instantly killed. In World War I, a fake Paris complete with a Champs-Élysées and Gare du Nord was built to fool German pilots. Railways and roads were built and illuminated during nighttime to make an impression of the real Paris. The goal of the decoy was to avoid loss of life and destruction in France's capital city. Physics fact: Karl Schwarzschild was a German physicist and astronomer who joined the military in 1914 at the outbreak of the war. In amongst being shot at all day and a crippling autoimmune disorder, he managed to write 3 papers, including 2 on the first exact solutions of Einstein's equations of general relativity. He died in 1916. This has probably already been mentioned, but the football match that took place in no man's land on Christmas Day in 1914. Nothing like a good old game of Togger to unite both sides. It highlights the tragedy that the same men went back to fighting the next day, and almost certainly killed some of the same men they'd played with. And of course, the Germans won the match. 2-1. The treaty to end the war was signed in a rail car outside Paris. When Hitler came to power and invaded France, he forced them to sign their own surrender in that same rail car, which he then blew up. The average life expectancy of a new pilot was 20 minutes. This improved to a few weeks if you survived your first combat mission. The Royal Flying Corps also did not issue parachutes as it would impair the fighting spirit. The Dutch remained neutral for the entire war. Though despite this, they did mobilize troops in forts, and were prepared to go to war if needed. They never did, despite the German offense into Belgium passing through the Dutch province of Limburg. As another point of note, the great military minds on every side were terrified of the possibility of having to fight a war in the Netherlands, because it would have made what actually happened in Flanders look desirable. The Indian British Army contributed greatly, with over 1 million who served, and over 70,000 killed. Their stories are mostly forgotten. They fought from East Africa to the Western Front, and were involved at famous conflicts like Ypres and Gallipoli. The 36th Ulster Division did what none of the other divisions could do at the Battle of the Somme, by managing to not only break through the German front line, but also reach the second line. So fast was the advance of the Ulstermen, that they came under their own barrage. Over 5,000 men were lost in 2 days, and the ground they captured had to be given up as none of the other allied troops had managed to break through. Under attack from 3 sides, the 36th had to fall back. They say every town and village in Northern Ireland lost someone. My great-grandfather was a gas victim. He survived the attack, but his lungs were destroyed. He survived a few years after. When it finally got him, my great-grandmother was still classed as a war widow and entitled to charity. However, they refused to give her anything until she sold her piano. The piano was their only form of income. She was a piano teacher, and they sold most of their valuables and the medal he got from the Great War years earlier, as my great-grandfather was unable to work. Then when my granddad volunteered in World War II, he picked the Royal Air Force. You could pick if you volunteered. My great-grandmother was relieved, as she thought he would be safest in the Air Force. Of course he was, and gas was not used anyway. However, imagine seeing your husband suffer and die from one war, only to send your son to the next. The term tank in the context of a tracked, armored fighting platform came from World War I. The British were the first to experiment with armored vehicles designed specifically to break the stalemate of trench warfare by punching through defensive lines. They called it a tank project to fool German intelligence into thinking it was a project to design fuel and water storage tanks, and the name stuck, at least in English. There is a grave in the Essex Farm Cemetery, near Ypres, Belgium, where lies the remains Captain Dr. Noel Chavis. He is one of only 3 soldiers that won 2 Victoria Crosses. The first, in 1916, was for rescuing wounded soldiers in no man's land. He was injured a number of times from bullets and shrapnel, but made a full recovery. The second cross was awarded posthumously, in 1917. He went forward with the soldiers to provide first aid and set up a makeshift clearing station for the wounded. However, the attack petered out and enemy artillery started to hit troops retreating. This includes hitting the clearing station, which needed to be evacuated. Chavez stayed behind to help the evacuation and was wounded by shrapnel. He was also evacuated, but died of wounds a few days later. I don't know if it's known now, but my grandfather always had a thing about never lighting 3 cigarettes in a row. Anytime there was a get together, he would light his, then someone else's, then would either blow out the match or stop the lighter. He used to say it was bad luck to light the third. Years later he told me it was from the First World War, when enemy snipers would use it to target people. First ciggy to know the direction where to aim, second for the range, and finally the third man was the one who got shot. He's got the bad luck. There are only 11 towns in England in which all the men who went off to fight returned from both world wars. One thing that I thought was fairly common, but people don't seem to be aware of, is, while red poppies symbolize remembrance of those who lost their lives, purple poppies symbolizes the same, but for animals, horses, dogs, etc. My grandfather was 19 when war ended. He always said he was stable boy for cavalry units stationed in southern Germany near Swiss border. After he died, we found his Iron Cross. Have no idea what he did to earn it. It was in World War I that chemical weapons were first used in such a big scale, which is why the war is also known as the Chemists' War. Fritz Haber, the man who fed the world by developing a process to use nitrogen from the air to make ammonia, is also the man known as the father of the chemical weapon. He was the one who proposed that Germans use chlorine gas in the trenches, killing hundreds during the Battle of Ypres, I think. Upon finding out about the deaths of those soldiers, Fritz Haber's wife Clara Moer, also a great chemist and the first woman in Germany with a PhD in chemistry, killed herself because she believed that science should never be used for such purposes. Haber won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1918, but was also considered a war criminal, which I think is why we don't hear about him as much as we hear about other great scientists from this period of time. I've also heard that World War I was a lot more gruesome than World War II. When the US entered the war, one thing they did that made something of a difference in the dug-in trench warfare of the time was America brought men who were skilled sharpshooters, armed with Winchester Model 1897 trench gun shotguns. The American shooters were tasked with shooting grenades out of the air that were being thrown by Germans. The trench gun was so effective and brutal a weapon, the Germans tried to claim using them was a war crime. One of the most gut-wrenching stories I've read, French shells began to hit to the right and left of us, leaving human forms writhing in agony. Our advance came to a stop, and after hesitating a few minutes we drew back, while the artillery fire followed us, ripping large gashes in our formation. Soon the French drum fire engulfed us. The air was filled with gas and flying pieces of steel. We automatically mounted the machine gun for action. Then, like animals, we burrowed into the earth, as if trying to find protection deep in its bosom. Something struck my back, but I did not pay attention to it. A steel splinter broke the handle of my spade and another knocked the remains out of my hand. I kept digging with my bare hands, ducking my head every time a shell exploded nearby. A boy to my side was hit in the arm and cried out for help. I crawled over to him, ripped the sleeves of his coat and shirt open, and started to bind the bleeding part. The gas was so thick now I could hardly discern what I was doing. I reached for my gas mask, pulled it out of its container, then noticed to my horror that a splinter had gone through it, leaving a large hole. I had seen death thousands of times, stared it in the face, but never experienced the fear I felt then. Immediately I reverted to the primitive. I felt like an animal cornered by hunters, with the instinct of self-preservation uppermost. My eyes fell on the boy whose arm I had bandaged. I leapt at him, and in the next moment, had ripped the gas mask from his face. With a feeble gesture he tried to wrench it from my grasp, then fell back exhausted. The last thing I saw, before putting on the mask, were his pleading eyes. T. Bradley quoted in a Scully, "The monster." The 1914 Christmas truce. Both the Germans and the British both got out of their trenches on Christmas Day to exchange gifts, play soccer together, and bury the dead. Personal family fact: I have a distant relative who was an attaché for Archduke Ferdinand and was even in Sarajevo when he was shot. Said relative was a tutor for the Habsburg family, including Ferdinand when he was young, and we found his record on Ellis Island, where his character reference was listed as some princess, and he ended up being a professor at Georgetown. Family law dictates he was present for the first assassination attempt that day, but then was off arranging the Archduke's visit to the hospital to meet with wounded members from the first attack when he finally got killed. My great-grandfather fought during the war, driving an ambulance. At one point, while he was driving, his position started getting shelled by mortar fire. He was so scared that he stopped driving and hid under the ambulance. A short while later, a French general drove up and asked for his name. He gave it to the general, and he drove off. He later received the Croix d'Aiguë for his actions. His citation: for repairing his vehicle while under mortar fire. To come to mind that others might not have said, Belgium is actually below sea level and had built structures to stop flooding. In one of the battles, Belgium opened its canal locks sluices to flood some areas in order to halt German progress. Note that this one would damage the land both because of the water and because it is salt water, and two, there wouldn't be any catastrophic consequences for Belgium if the war had ended at this point and Germany won. This event occurred only 2 months into the war. However, both sides lost a lot of men by this point only a couple of months into the war, and because of that, as well as pride in one's country, Belgium ruined some of its own land and the war would go on for 4 years. I said it before, but people were really dedicated for their country. Soldiers were executed without fair trial for leaving post, even temporarily without approval. This was seen as an act of cowardice and was used to serve as an example for everyone. It was coercive, but many of military leaders and regular soldiers did have at least some belief towards this high standard. Some of the soldiers executed even agreed with this, especially early in the war. Despite the reality of shell shock, it was like a ritual for everyone. In Flanders, Belgium, wounded men were left to die by their own troops in no man's land. One man who was shot in the ankle crawled for a week back to the Allied trenches, taking food from the haversacks of dead comrades to keep himself alive. Another man was so close to the German lines that one night, 2 German sentries ran out to give him food and coffee, but were forbidden to bring any prisoners back with them. Consider subscribing if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more of Reddit Universe.